Last weekend I had the privilege of heading down to Brighton for a very special war game, one that combined a fascinating imaginations campaign, some rather splendid old school miniatures, and the opportunity to spend the day in the company of one of the hobby's genuine legends. And I was going to get the chance to play with figures that had once belonged to some of the pioneers of our hobby, and that made this much more than just another game of toy soldiers. I've known Henry Hyde for several years now, usually in that slightly strange way that you get when you get to know people through the wargaming circuit. You know, we've met at shows such as Salute and Partisan, had a quick chat, exchanged pleasantries, talked about whatever project happens to be occupying us at the time, and then inevitably we've been swept along by the crowds. Now, when I first started the channel, Henry had me on his Battle Chat podcast, which was probably the longest conversation we've ever had. Up until this weekend. So when Henry invited me down to his home in Brighton for a game in the infamous Loftwaffe, I was rather pleased to accept. Thankfully, although it was a warm day, it wasn't quite the furnace that Brighton would become a few days later, so we weren't actually baked alive in the Loftwaffe. There was plenty of water, a very nice lunch, and perhaps most importantly, plenty of conversation. Now, it's one of the things I really enjoyed about the day. Yes, we were there to play a war game, but there was no rush to get through it. There was no pressure to turn the whole thing into some sort of competitive examination. We could stop, chat about the game, talk about the hobby, discuss figures and rules, wander off down various historical rabbit holes, and then eventually remember that there was supposed to be a battle going on. Now, for those that perhaps don't know Henry or his work, he's one of those people who has had an enormous influence on the modern British wargaming scene. He launched Battle Games magazine in 2006, eventually becoming Miniature Wargames with Battle Games, and continued editing and designing the publication until 2016. He's also the author of the Wargaming Compendium and the Wargaming Campaigns, and has continued to produce games, books, podcasts and other projects through his Gladius publications and through Battle Chat. In other words, when it comes to wargaming, Henry has been around the block a few times. He's been writing about it, designing games, interviewing people, building campaigns, and generally poking the hobby with a stick for rather longer than I've been making YouTube videos. And he's also a thoroughly nice chap, which is always a bonus when you're going to spend an entire day sitting opposite someone trying to work out what your troops are supposed to be doing. Now, the game we were playing used Henry's own rules, shot, steel and stone, which were originally introduced in the Wargaming Compendium before being developed into a standalone rule set. They're designed primarily for the horse and musket period, so roughly from the late 17th century through to the middle of the 19th. One of the things that I particularly like about them is that they don't seem overly concerned with telling you that you have to play the game in one particular way. They're scale and basin agnostic, so you can use the miniatures you already have rather than finding yourself in the familiar wargaming situation where the first thing you have to do before playing a new rule set is spend several £100 rebasing your army. The mechanics are deliberately accessible, but that doesn't mean that the game lacks friction. Command and control plays an important role, and local commanders can experience that rather wonderful thing we call tactical uncertainty. You might have a perfectly good plan sitting in your head, but getting the troops on the table to actually follow it is another matter entirely. There's also opportunities for the non-active player to react, which gives the game a little more life than simply taking turns moving your entire army around while your opponent politely waits for you to finish. The result is a system that feels suited to the sort of narrative campaign gaming that Henry enjoys, where the game itself is part of a larger story rather than simply an isolated exercise in counting victory points. But if I'm honest, the rules weren't exactly the thing I was most excited about. Henry has an extraordinary collection of wargaming books, which is frankly enough to make it any enthusiast of a certain age slightly green with envy. But alongside the books are some genuine pieces of wargaming history. Over the years, Henry has acquired figures and terrain that have belonged to some of the great names of the hobby, including Charles Grant, Donald Featherstone and Stuart Asquith. These are people whose names appear repeatedly whenever we start talking about the history of miniature wargaming, and their influence can still be seen in the way many of us approach the hobby today. What makes this even more special is that these figures aren't simply sitting behind glass. Henry's restored them and continues to use them in games. And I think that's rather wonderful. There's something fundamentally right about a wargaming miniature being used for wargaming, regardless of whether it happens to be 5 months old or nearly 70 years old. A figure that has been painted, played with, and perhaps survived several generations of gamers has a history of its own, and putting it back on the tabletop allows that history to continue. And that brings us neatly to Spencer Smith miniatures. The figures we were using were the classic 30mm plastic 18th century figures, and by modern standards they are, shall we say, rather less burdened with detail than miniatures that are available to us today. You aren't going to spend 3 hours painting the buttons on one Spencer Smith Grenadier because there simply aren't enough buttons to keep you occupied for 3 hours, but that's not really the point. There is something incredibly appealing about the proportions and simplicity of these figures. They have a slender, elegant appearance and were designed to be painted relatively easily, and more importantly, massed together on the tabletop. When you put a large number of them together, they look like a regiment rather than a collection of individual miniatures. That distinction matters to me. One of the things I love about historical wargaming is seeing formations represented on the table, and those old Spencer Smith figures were made exactly for that. The figures date back to a very different era of the hobby, when the idea of creating a regiment of miniatures was rather different from what we might consider normal today. The original Spencer Smith ranges included 18th century figures, as well as Napoleonics, American Civil War, Zulu Wars, and other historical eras, with both 30mm and 42mm ranges available. The company itself passed through several hands over the decades, and Spencer Smith figures remain available to collectors today. But what really struck me about the figures on Henry's table wasn't simply their age, it was who had owned them. Some of the regiments Henry has in his collection once belonged to Charles Grant, whose 1971 book, The Wargame, is one of those publications that has become almost mythical within the hobby. If you've seen it, you'll know exactly the sort of thing I mean. Those wonderful black and white photographs of huge armies laid out across the expansive tables helped define what wargaming looked like for an entire generation. The Östergötland regiment of Spencer Smith figures that Henry has in his collection were originally owned and painted by Charles Grant and date from that era, and they were sitting on the table right there in front of me. I've been playing wargames for more than 40 years, and like many people that have been involved in the hobby for that long, I've developed a fascination with its history. I've read the books, looked at old photographs and heard the stories about the people who helped shape what we now recognise as tabletop wargaming. So to actually pick up figures that had been part of that history and use them in a game was a genuinely remarkable experience. Now, Henry has made a video about restoring the Östergötland regiment, and if you have any interest in the history of the hobby, I really do recommend seeking it out. There's something wonderfully circular about the whole story. Those figures were painted decades ago, appeared in one of the seminal books of British wargaming, passed through the hands of the family, and eventually found their way to Henry, who restored them and put them back into active service. And then all these years later, some bloke called Big Lee gets to march them across the table. I'm not sure thrilled really covers it. So what about the actual game? Well, this is where I'm going to have to disappoint anyone hoping for a detailed blow-by-blow battle report, because I was far too busy trying to understand what I was doing and avoid making a complete tit of myself in front of Henry. There's something slightly intimidating about playing a rule set written by the person sitting opposite you, particularly when you know that that person knows the rules a lot better than you do. Every time I considered doing something, I found myself wondering whether Henry was thinking, oh dear, what's he doing now? The game formed part of Henry's ongoing Imaginations campaign, which is one of the great pleasures of this particular fictional setting. I was commanding the army of the Grenouisse, pursuing the army of Borgenmark following an earlier battle. The Borg commander-in-chief, Jean-F. Bert, had several options available to him. He could head northwest towards the narrow valley and woods around Pedigree, move north towards the considerably closer and defensible foothills around Verstur, or head north towards Targeland, potentially exposing his flank to my forces, but offering the possibility of reinforcements from Ofterberg. The Borgenmark commander chose the foothills. Unfortunately for him, the Grenouisse were coming after him. The important thing to understand here was that this was never really going to be a pitched battle. Most of my force consisted of light troops, and my objective was to harass the retreating Borgenmark army and delay it, rather than stand toe-to-toe with disciplined 18th century infantry. This meant using mobility, finding opportunities to attack the column, and generally making life as uncomfortable as possible for the Borg army before the main body of the Grenouisse army could catch up. My light cavalry proved particularly useful in this role. They were fast enough to sweep around the flank and threaten the ball column, forcing the enemy to stop its advance and turn to face the threat. In terms of my immediate objective, I think that was a success. I'd slowed the retreat and prevented the Borgenmark troops from simply marching unmolested onto their defensive positions in the hills. The problem was that there's a reason light cavalry don't normally want to charge disciplined infantry lines head on. My cavalry paid for their success. Several regiments were forced to fall back or eventually retire altogether, and while they'd done their job by disrupting the column, they certainly weren't going to be riding triumphantly into the foothills and driving the entire Borg army away. Sometimes in wargaming, achieving your objective looks suspiciously like getting your troops shot at until they decide they've had enough. Fortunately, my light infantry performed rather better. I had several units of chasseurs de pied who acquitted themselves extremely well, supported by a light gun that was attached to them. Between cavalry action and artillery fire, we managed to effectively wipe out a Borg cavalry regiment, with another falling under the sabres of my light cavalry. So although I had taken casualties and lost some of my cavalry, the Borgenmark army had certainly been made to pay for the delay. And that's where the game ended, with the really interesting question still hanging over the campaign. Had I done enough? Had my harassment slowed the Borg advance sufficiently to prevent Jean of Bert from establishing a strong defensive position in the foothills around Verster before the main Grenouissian army arrived? Or had I merely sacrificed a collection of perfectly good light cavalry to make the enemy slightly annoyed before they got into position? I genuinely don't know, and that's part of what makes the Imaginations campaign so much fun. The story doesn't end when you pack the figures away. Consequences of the game carry forward into the next one, and what happened on this particular day becomes part of a much larger narrative. I suspect Henry will eventually write up the action in his campaign journal, which is itself a rather wonderful example of how far you can take this sort of wargaming if you're prepared to invest the time and imagination. And that really was the thing that I took away from my day in the Loftwaffe. Yes, I got to play with some wonderfully old figures. Yes, I got to try Shot, Steel and Stone. Yes, I got to spend a day playing an Imaginations game in one of the hobby's more famous gaming spaces. But perhaps more importantly, I got to experience something that reminds us why the history of our hobby matters. Those Spencer Smith figures aren't technically impressive by modern standards. They don't have the intricate sculpting and elaborate equipment or microscopic details that we can find on modern miniatures today. But put a few dozen of them together on the table and suddenly become something much more than the sum of their parts. Add the knowledge that some of them were painted by Charles Grant and appeared in The Wargame, and they become a physical connection to the people and games that came before us. And perhaps that's something worth remembering as our hobby continues to evolve. We're incredibly fortunate to live in an age where we have access to extraordinary miniatures, laser cutting, resin, 3D printing, CAD sculpting, and all sorts of technological wizardry that the pioneers of the hobby could scarcely have imagined. But that doesn't make the old stuff irrelevant. Quite the opposite. Sometimes the simplest figures can carry the biggest stories. So I would like to finish by saying a huge thank you to Henry for inviting me down, for allowing me to rummage around in the Loftwaffe, for trusting me with some rather precious pieces of wargaming history, and of course for putting up with me and my attempts to command an army using his rules. It was genuinely a memorable day, and one that I feel very lucky to have experienced. So what about you? Do you own any Spencer Smith figures? Perhaps you inherited some, picked them up second hand, or maybe you're one of those people who've been collecting them for decades. And do you still put them on the tabletop, or does the thought of handling nearly 70-year-old plastic make you nervous enough to reach for the bubble wrap? I'd love to know what you think about old school miniatures, and whether you see them as historical artifacts, gaming pieces, or perhaps a little bit of both. Let me know your experiences in the comments, because I think the history of our hobby is something we can all enjoy. That's it for today. Jump in the comments now and hit the like, subscribe and the bell button right now so you don't miss out on the next video. Until next time, stay safe, keep gaming, and of course, keep rolling high.